There's an old story, far older than the Sanctum Universum, of someone who walked the settled systems and saw every corner of it. This pilgrim claimed he found the true meaning of unity. I always thought of it as just a parable for trying to bring humanity together, but maybe it's more.
Somewhere in New Atlantis, the most advanced city humanity has ever built, there are two institutions that exist in deliberate contrast to each other. One stands gleaming above in the commercial district, golden and open to the sky. The other sits below ground in the well, in the part of the city the upper streets prefer not to think about. Both offer answers to the same question. Both believe the other is wrong. And yet, every morning, people walk through the doors of both. That should not be remarkable. It feels like the most ordinary thing in the world. Two institutions, two philosophies, two ways of making sense of existence, existing in the same capital city of a civilization that has colonized dozens of star systems. But stay with it for a moment. This is a civilization that has solved interstellar travel, that has built habitats in orbit, terraformed moons, extended human lifespans, and mapped more of the cosmos than any generation before them ever dreamed possible. These are people who, when they look up at the night sky, recognize the stars by name, not as mythology, not as navigation, but as destinations, familiar ones. And they still built churches. That is the thing that quietly refuses to go away. Not the existence of religion in Starfield's settled systems. That alone is unsurprising because history teaches us that belief is persistent, that it evolves and adapts and finds new forms long after its old ones seem to have been outgrown. What is genuinely strange, when you sit with it, is not that these institutions survived into the 24th century. It is what they survived for, what they are actually doing in a civilization like this one. What need they fill that grav drives and terraforming and the accumulated knowledge of 2.5 centuries of interstellar exploration cannot. Because when you move through the settled systems and pay attention to the texture of belief, you find there the ceremonies, the arguments, the violence, the quiet devotion. Something becomes clear that no single institution would admit. None of them, not the cathedral in New Atlantis, nor the zealots in the void, nor the wandering philosopher who walked the settled systems and left journals of his questions at the edge of the inhabited map, none of them are really talking about God. Or not only about God, they are talking about what it means to be small in an infinite universe, and how to survive that feeling, and whether there is any version of peace that does not require placing something enormous at the center of your life and calling it sacred. The settled systems did not leave religion behind when they left Earth, and that raises a question that gets more interesting the longer you hold it. Not whether humanity still believes, clearly it does, but why? What the stars actually revealed when humanity finally reached them, and whether what was found out there made the need for faith larger or smaller, or simply different in ways that no one was prepared for. Begin with the simplest version of the story, the one that seems like an answer, until you look more closely. The Sanctum Universum, headquartered in a cathedral in New Atlantis that the rest of the UC skyline seems to have arranged itself respectfully around, holds a theology that could only have been born in a spacefaring age. God in their understanding, did not create the universe and then withdraw from it. God exists within it, somewhere specific, present, and waiting. A higher power not merely responsible for existence, but actively involved in it, guiding humanity toward a meeting that is still to come. The Grav drive in Sanctum theology is not simply a technological achievement. It is an invitation, evidence that whatever is out there wants to be found and has given humanity the means to do the finding. What makes this theology genuinely different from the traditions that preceded it is that direction of travel. Earlier religious frameworks, the ones that survived the collapse in fragments and traveled with humanity into space, tended to locate God outside the cosmos, transcendent, beyond the observable, accessible only through prayer or revelation or death. The Sanctum inverted this. God is not at the edge of experience. God is in the middle of it, not watching from somewhere beyond the stars, but present among them, leaving evidence of that presence in the very structure of a universe that turned out to be crossable. The desire to explore and the desire to find God are, in this reading, the same desire. Humanity has been given the stars because it was meant to go looking. There is something genuinely elegant about this. It is a theology designed to be undamageable by discovery. The traditional religious critique of science, that it displaces the divine, that every answered question diminishes the space in which faith can live, does not apply here. For the Sanctum, every answered question expands the terrain of the sacred. The more you learn about the universe, the closer you potentially come to its author. The two pursuits are not in competition. They are the same endeavor. Remarkably, the Sanctum is not an ancient institution. It formed only about 20 years before the events of the game, barely a generation old by the time you encounter it in the plazas of New Atlantis. That it has grown so rapidly in such a short time, in a civilization with 2 centuries of interstellar travel already behind it, suggests something significant about the moment. Not that faith is new to the settled systems, but that this particular form of it, one that speaks the language of exploration as worship, arrived exactly when the civilization needed it. When the frontier had become familiar enough that the original wonder of the stars required a new vocabulary, and old Earth traditions no longer fit the shape of the life people were actually living. It is worth considering what a radical departure this represents from the traditions the Sanctum drew on when it was founded. The major Earth religions that survived the collapse and the long migrations were not, in most of their forms, designed for a heliocentric cosmos, let alone an interstellar one. They assumed a world at the center of things, literally or metaphorically, and God at the edge, or above it, or beyond it. Distance was sacred. Separation was part of the structure of the divine. The universe was a stage set for a human drama that God was watching from somewhere outside. The Sanctum dismantled all of that, not with argument exactly, but with reorientation. God is not watching from outside. God is somewhere within, present, directional, pulling toward a meeting that is still to come. This move required rethinking the entire geometry of the sacred. If God is within the cosmos, then moving through the cosmos is moving toward God. Every charted system is potentially a step closer. every frontier is the frontier of something more than space. The grav drive is, in this reading, not just a technological achievement, but a spiritual one. Every jump is a kind of pilgrimage. Walk through the cathedral and you feel this intention in the architecture. The building reaches upward in a way that speaks less of the ornate ecclesiastical grandeur of old earth traditions and more of something cleaner, an aspiration toward open sky rather than a closing off of it. Light comes through in ways that feel deliberate. The design does not shut the world out. It frames it. It asks you to look at what is beyond the glass and find something holy in the looking. The clergy of the sanctum are not removed from daily life in the settled systems. They engage with the community. They offer counsel. They run charitable operations that extend beyond New Atlantis to the broader reaches of settled space. Theirs is not a monastic withdrawal. It is an active, present faith, one that insists the divine can be found precisely where people actually are, in the stations and on the frontier planets, and out in the difficult places where the map has not yet been fully drawn. The Sanctum's missionaries do not travel to convert the frontier in the traditional sense of that word. They travel because travel is, for them, already worship, because the act of going to the hard places and being present in them is itself a form of prayer. The distinction between ministry and pilgrimage in sanctum theology barely exists, and yet, hold this theology up to the light for a moment, and something shows through that the sanctum, in its gentler moments, might even acknowledge. A faith built entirely on wonder, on the rapture of exploration, on the sense that every new discovery is a new face of God, is a faith that depends on wonder being continually renewable. It requires that the universe keeps surprising you, that there is always more to find, always a depth not yet reached, always a revelation waiting past the next gravitational anomaly. For a civilization that has been exploring for over 2 centuries, this is not a trivial requirement. There are people in the settled systems who were born on colony ships, who grew up on terraformed moons, for whom the experience of standing on an alien world and looking at an alien sky is not a rapture but a Tuesday. The frontier retains its strangeness, certainly. Space is large enough that it never fully domesticates. But the psychological experience of being a spacefaring human in the 24th century is not the same as being the first generation to leave the cradle. The sense of first contact with the infinite is not something you can manufacture indefinitely, even with a theology designed to make every discovery feel like prayer. This is what the sanctum's architecture cannot quite resolve. It builds upward toward the light. It opens its doors to the cosmos. It insists that wonder and faith are one. But it cannot guarantee the wonder. It can only offer a framework for recognizing it when it comes. And some people, many people it turns out, decided that framework was not what they needed. While the sanctum reaches upward in New Atlantis' commercial district, golden, gleaming, visible from most of the city's upper streets, the house of the Enlightened is somewhere else entirely. Take an elevator down from the surface and you arrive in the Well, the underground district that New Atlantis officially acknowledges and unofficially ignores. This is where the city's service workers and poorer residents actually live, away from the clean public face of the UC's capital. And this is where the Enlightened chose to put their house. The building occupies a central space in the well, its name written in large letters on the wall. Less elevated is almost an understatement. It is below ground, and the people it serves are largely the people that the gleaming above-ground institutions were not built for. Whether the Enlightened chose this location out of philosophical conviction or practical circumstance is not something the record makes clear, but the effect is legible regardless. The sanctum inhabits the public, opulent, forward-facing part of New Atlantis. The Enlightened inhabit the part that actually needs them. The Enlightened are not a religious organization. They are explicit about this. They hold no supernatural beliefs, make no claims about the divine, and regard the universe as exactly what the evidence suggests it is. Extraordinary, yes, but explicable in principle, amenable to reason, not requiring a God to give it meaning. What they hold instead is a faith in humanity itself, in its capacity for compassion, for reason, for the construction of meaning out of raw experience, without appealing to anything beyond the human. Call it secular humanism, which is the most accurate description, though the Enlightened would note that the word humanism carries its own weight, its own sense of the profound. They do not believe that removing the supernatural from the picture leaves you with nothing. They believe it leaves you with everything that actually matters. The people standing in front of you, the work of building something worth living in, the responsibility that comes with knowing that no divine hand is going to correct your mistakes. If the Sanctum's theology is one of rapture, the Enlightened's is one of accountability. The tension between these two institutions in New Atlantis is not hostile exactly, but it is real. It is the oldest conversation in the history of human thought, relocated to a different century and given new details, but not, in its essential nature, changed very much. The Sanctum says, meaning comes from beyond us, and our task is to reach toward it. The Enlightened say, meaning comes from within us, and our task is to build it carefully. Both believe in the importance of the work. Both serve their communities with genuine commitment. Neither, in the day-to-day texture of the settled systems, can quite stop looking sideways at the other. What is worth noticing is that the Enlightened, despite their explicit rejection of the supernatural, exhibit many of the structural features of a religious community. They gather, they share values, they have ethical commitments that they would describe as non-negotiable. They undertake charitable work not because a God commanded it, but because they believe with something approaching conviction that it is right. They form identity around their worldview in exactly the way that religious communities form identity around theirs. The rituals are less elaborate, the metaphysics are stripped away, but the social and psychological functions, belonging, meaning, moral orientation, the comfort of community, are the same. This is not a critique of the Enlightened. It is, if anything, evidence for something they might be reluctant to say plainly, that the things religion provides are not primarily the things it claims to provide. The Sanctum says it offers access to God. The Enlightened say it offers the same things the Sanctum does, minus the theology that the Enlightened find unsupported. And the fact that the Enlightened have to provide those same things, the gathering, the ethics, the community, the sense of shared meaning, suggests that those things are not optional, that they are requirements of human social existence, not luxuries, that a civilization of spacefaring rationalists turns out to need them just as badly as a civilization of earth-bound believers. There is a word for the thing that both the Sanctum and the Enlightened are circling, though neither would be comfortable using it for the other's tradition. That word is faith. Not necessarily faith in God, but faith in something, in the value of exploration, in the dignity of persons, in the possibility that meaning is real and not just a story we tell ourselves to get through the night. Both institutions require their members to commit to things that cannot be fully proven. The Sanctum asks you to believe that the universe is a cathedral. The Enlightened ask you to believe that humanity is worth building around. Neither of these is a fact. Both of them require something that functions exactly like religious devotion to sustain. And then, further out in the dark, there is House Va'ruun, which is what happens when that devotion has no floor. The story of House Va'ruun begins with a grav jump and a vision. The colony ship Archimedes launched from New Atlantis in 2190, made its way out to Mars, and then jumped from there into deep space and went silent. Lost, as far as the settled systems was concerned, somewhere in the dark between systems. What happened aboard that ship during the years of isolation is known now only through Va'ruun's own account of it, which is to say, it is known through the lens of the faith it produced. What the record says is that during the final grav jump into the Kavnik system in 2191, Jinan Va'ruun, a passenger, not a leader, not yet anything in particular, experienced what he described as a communion, a meeting with something vast and ancient that he called the Great Serpent. And what the Great Serpent told him became the founding document of a civilization. The prophecy Jinan carried out of that encounter was not a promise of salvation. It was a promise of ending. The Great Serpent would one day devour the universe entire, an event that Va'ruun's scripture calls the Shrouding. All things would be consumed. The only meaningful question was not whether this would happen, but how you related to it. Whether you spent the time between now and the shrouding in ignorance and denial, or in devotion to the force that was coming. Va'ruun theology did not offer escape from annihilation. It offered a way of meeting it with open eyes. The theology that grew from this is not, on its face, designed to comfort. The Great Serpent is not a god of love or of wisdom or of cosmic beneficence. It is a god of annihilation. The eschatology at the heart of Va'ruunism is not one of reward for the faithful, but of consumption for everyone, with the implication, never made quite explicit, but always present, that devotion might distinguish you in some way from the simply devoured. It is faith as preparation for catastrophe, religion as a survival strategy for the end of all things. The early development of Va'ruun society is difficult to trace from the outside, which is partly the point. Va'ruun has always been intentionally opaque, and the account of its founding that reaches the broader settled systems is the account Va'ruun has chosen to release, filtered through the same institutional machinery that produced the crusade. But the broad shape is legible enough. Jinan's vision gave the tradition its cosmological spine. The universe has a predator. The predator is inevitable, and the only response is devotion. Around this spine, a complete social order grew, hierarchy built around proximity to the serpent's will, ritual built around the management of fear and the performance of readiness, a theology of sacrifice that made death not something to mourn, but something to offer. What is easy to miss, looking at Va'ruun from the outside, is that this social architecture was not simply imposed on people by a charismatic founder and maintained by force, though force certainly played its role. It also worked. A community organized entirely around a shared cosmic terror is a community with extraordinary internal coherence. Va'ruunists knew, with the certainty that only shared existential belief can provide, exactly what they were for, and exactly who their enemies were. The ambiguity and negotiation that characterize political life in New Atlantis or Aquila City or Sidonia were, in the theology of the serpent, resolved. You were either preparing for the end or you were wasting the time you had been given. You were either in the faith or you were outside it. The clarity was terrible and totalizing, and for people who find ambiguity genuinely unbearable, possibly a relief. You might expect a theology this dark to attract only the most desperate or the most unstable, people on the margins, people with nothing else. What is unsettling about House Va'ruun is that it became a civilization, not a cult, not a splinter movement, not a handful of true believers gathered around a charismatic founder. A functioning, organized, politically sophisticated society built entirely around the worship of something that wants to destroy everything. One of the major power structures of the settled systems, treated with wary respect by the UC and the Freestar Collective, even as its citizens regard those organizations with something between pity and contempt. The Serpent's Crusade is where the distance between Va'ruun and the rest of the settled systems calcified into something permanent. Va'ruunist zealots moved through inhabited space, killing people, not for territory, not for resources, not for any of the conventional reasons that organized violence tends to organize itself around, but for the serpent, for the faith. They died for it willingly, which made them uniquely difficult to fight in the way that you fight ordinary adversaries. You cannot threaten someone with death when they regard death as a form of transcendence. You cannot negotiate with a value system that does not share your premise that survival is the primary good. The crusade ended not through defeat, but through succession. Jinan died in 2263 after more than 2 decades of war, and his son Jarek inherited both the faith and the catastrophe his father had made of its foreign policy. Jarek sued for peace, a decision that fractured Va'ruun from within, producing a splinter movement that refused to accept the ceasefire and continued raiding in the Serpent's name. By the time of the game's events, the main body of House Va'ruun has withdrawn entirely, cutting communications with the settled systems and retreating to a homeworld whose coordinates it keeps secret even from most of its own agents. What remains visible in the settled systems are the Va'ruun zealots, the ones who stayed behind or were left behind and who continue to attack in the name of a theology that the institution they came from has officially, if ambivalently, stepped back from. This fragmentation is worth sitting with. House Va'ruun, at its core, is a civilization trying to reconcile the violent legacy of its founding faith with the practical requirements of continued existence in a system of other powers. The Zealots represent the theological logic taken to its conclusion, uncomplicated by political necessity. They are what the faith looks like when it has no counterweight, when the shrouding is not a distant eschatological horizon, but an immediate operational premise, when the fact of the universe's eventual end is used to justify ending things now, specifically in the name of the serpent, whether the serpent has asked you to or not. What the great serpent mythology actually does, functionally, psychologically, for the people living inside it, is not so different from what other apocalyptic traditions do, and there is a long enough history of those to draw from. A cosmic threat, too large to meaningfully fight, reframed as a sacred promise. The terror of the universe's indifference, of the knowledge that entropy wins in the end, and that all constructed things eventually come apart, transmuted into doctrine. Instead of confronting the void of cosmic meaninglessness and finding nothing there, Va'ruunism looks into that void and names what it sees. The serpent is not a comforting name, but it is a name. And naming the thing that frightens you most is one of the oldest and most distinctly human responses to fear that we know of. This is the mirror that Va'ruun holds up to the more palatable faiths of New Atlantis. The Sanctum looks at the universe and sees God. The Enlightened look at the universe and see humanity. Va'ruun looks at the universe and sees the end coming, and says that this, too, deserves worship, that even annihilation is sacred if it is large enough, that the only honest response to living in a cosmos that will eventually destroy everything is to prostrate yourself before the destroying force and call it divine. It is extreme. It has produced atrocities. It is, by the standards of the settled systems, the faith most willing to translate belief into violence. But strip away the violence and the isolation, and what remains is something that the Sanctum and the Enlightened are both, in their gentler ways, also responding to. The knowledge that the universe is larger than humanity, that the stars do not care whether humanity survives, that all the exploration and settlement and civilization building in the settled systems has not, in any fundamental sense, made human beings any less mortal, any less contingent, any less subject to forces they did not create and cannot ultimately control. Va'ruun's mistake, if it can be called one mistake given its many, is in the direction of the response. Worship of the destroying force does not neutralize it. It simply gives the fear a ritual form and calls that survival. But the fear itself, the recognition of smallness in the face of the infinite, that is not a mistake. That is, if anything, the clearest-eyed thing that any tradition in the settled systems has managed to articulate. The great serpent is a symbol. What it symbolizes is true. Outside of all three institutions, beyond the plazas of New Atlantis and the hidden spaces of Va'ruun, there is a different kind of theology. Quieter, more scattered, found not in buildings or in organized doctrine, but in words left behind on rocks and terminals and the walls of places that a person passed through once and never returned to. The Pilgrim did not found a church. They did not gather followers or write a scripture or establish anything that could be pointed at as an institution. What the Pilgrim did was walk across the settled systems, encountering the founders of what would become the Enlightened, sitting with what would become Va'ruun, introducing symbols of the unity to people who had no framework for them, and watching what those people made of them. And then, at the end, choosing a remote outpost on a distant moon called Indum II, and stopping, settling, leaving behind for whoever came looking a collection of journals. Reading the Pilgrim's writings is an exercise in something that feels different from reading doctrine. Doctrine wants you to arrive somewhere. It is pointing toward a conclusion, toward a belief to hold, toward a community to join. The Pilgrim's words feel more like watching someone think out loud in real time about questions they know they cannot fully answer. Questions about what the unity is, about what it means to pass through it, about what you are exactly on the other side, whether you are still the same person, whether anything that constituted you before has survived the transit, or whether the consciousness that emerges from the unity carrying your memories is simply a very convincing copy, and the original stayed behind somewhere, and you simply have not noticed yet. What gives the Pilgrim's writings their particular weight is not the quality of the answers they arrive at, because they rarely arrive at answers. It is the quality of the attention. The writings deal with the burden of caring for people, with the tension between knowing more than those around you and being unable to simply leave them to their ignorance, with what it means to understand something, the unity, the structure of the cosmos, that no institution has prepared anyone to understand. Based on what the writings do address, it is reasonable to assume the Pilgrim had reckoned, across multiple transits, with the peculiar alienation of being a Starborn, each new universe carrying all the memories of the last, but none of its relationships intact. The same faces, the same cities, the same broad shape of civilization, but without the specific texture of what was built before. You arrive already missing something the new universe never had. The Pilgrim's computer, which guards his final journal at Pilgrim's Rest, asks that you demonstrate you have read and understood the writings. Its questions are not trivia. They are gates. The Pilgrim ensuring that whoever enters has genuinely sat with what he left. This is the existential vertigo at the center of the Starborn condition, and the Pilgrim sits with it without resolving it. They do not conclude that the unity is God. They do not conclude that it is not. They hold the uncertainty with what reads, across the distance of the entries, as something like discipline, a refusal to reach for comfort when honesty requires discomfort, a willingness to remain in the question, rather than manufacturing an answer simply because the question is difficult to survive. What the Pilgrim discovers, or moves toward across the writings without quite arriving, is that the unity is not an answer to the religious question. It is the question made physical. Every tradition in the settled systems, in its own way, is reaching toward transcendence, the sanctum through the rapture of discovery, the enlightened through the cultivation of human potential towards something greater than any individual, Va'ruun through the surrender to a force that exceeds all human scale. These are different directions, radically different in their textures and their costs. But they are all gestures toward the same thing, a way out of the limits of ordinary human existence. A door in the wall of finitude. The unity is that door. Literally, you walk through it and you step from one version of reality into another. Your body does not change. Your memories do not change. The story you tell about who you are does not change. But the universe around you does, quietly and completely. And there is something in that transaction, something in the gap between the person who approached the unity and the person who walked out of it, that the Pilgrim spent years trying to describe and never quite could. The closest they come is not a theological statement, but an observation about experience. That the person who passes through the unity does not feel transformed in the way that religious transformation is supposed to feel. There is no rapture, no dissolution, no sense of having been remade. There is only the other side, which looks almost the same as the side you left, and the growing quiet awareness that almost the same is not the same. That the version of reality you are now standing in has no memory of you, that you are not arriving. You are, in some sense, that the Pilgrim keeps circling without naming, haunting. This is not peace, but the Pilgrim treats it as something worth understanding rather than something to flee. And in that refusal to flee, in the choice to remain with the vertigo, rather than converting it into doctrine, there is something that the organized religions of the settled systems, in their different ways, have all decided not to do. The Sanctum converts wonder into certainty. The Enlightened convert uncertainty into a project. Va'ruun converts terror into devotion. The Pilgrim does none of these things. They simply keep walking and keep writing and leave the question open. The unity is the hardest thing to talk about clearly because it is both a concrete phenomenon, a navigational feature of the cosmos with specific properties that can be observed and measured and passed through, and something that resists being simply that. You cannot encounter the unity without also encountering every question it raises about identity, about continuity, about the relationship between consciousness and the universe it inhabits. The Starborn are the people who have made the transit, some of them many times. Each passage is a rebirth in the most literal sense available. You emerge into a universe where your previous actions have not occurred, where the relationships you built do not exist in quite the same form, where the version of you who made those choices is, from the perspective of this new reality, simply absent. You carry the memory. The universe does not. What the Starborn encounter over multiple transits, over the accumulated weight of lives lived and shed like skins, is something that ordinary religious experience only gestures toward metaphorically. Resurrection, the dissolution of a fixed self, the recognition that the ego, the sense of being one continuous, uninterrupted person moving through time, is at least partly a story, and that the unity demonstrates this not through argument, but through lived experience. You are not who you were. The universe you knew is gone. A new one is here. Proceed. From what can be observed of Starborn behavior in the settled systems, different people respond to this in ways that map onto religious archetypes with an almost uncomfortable neatness. Some, it seems, become something like missionaries, convinced that the unity represents the most important truth available, and that others should be guided toward it, whether they wish to be or not. The emissary's role protecting mortals from those who would abuse the power of the Starborn, could be read as its own kind of priesthood. Others appear to have shed every previous attachment, moving through the settled systems as if already half absent, committed to little except the next transit. And there are those who attempt to rebuild what they lost, returning to the same places, the same people, finding that the reconstruction never quite holds. These patterns are inferences drawn from what can be seen of Starborn conduct, but if you watch long enough, the shapes become recognizable. The question the Unity raises for the religious traditions of the settled systems is one that none of them have fully integrated, possibly because doing so would require changes to their foundational premises that their institutions are not built to accommodate. The Sanctum teaches that God is revealed through exploration. The Unity is the most extreme form of exploration imaginable, not just the discovery of new space, but the transit between realities, the dissolution of the self in the passage. If exploration is worship, what is this? The Sanctum's theology should have a response, and one senses that it does not quite. The Enlightened teach that meaning is made by humans, in the human sphere, through the human work of building and caring and reasoning. The Starborn condition complicates what it means to be human in ways the Enlightened's framework was not designed for. When you have lived 4 lives in 4 universes, when the self that emerged from the first transit is not quite the same as the self that entered it, what is the humanist project building toward? Who, exactly, is the self that the Enlightened are asking to take responsibility for the meaning of its existence? Va'ruun, oddly, comes closest to a framework that can accommodate the Unity, though not in any way that Va'ruun would recognize or welcome. If the Great Serpent is the consuming force at the end of all things, the Unity is a kind of voluntary consumption, a choosing to be devoured by the infinite and reborn in another form. The Serpent's theology of annihilation and rebirth, and the Starborn experience of transit and emergence rhyme with each other in ways that, if a Va'ruunist were in a reflective mood rather than a violent one, might be worth sitting with. But institutions are not generally built for that kind of sitting with. They are built to provide certainty, because certainty is what communities can organize around. And the Unity provides anything but certainty. It provides a door, and whatever you find on the other side, and the long work of making sense of it alone, in a universe where no one else has quite your history or your scars. The Pilgrim understood this. The organizations of New Atlantis have not yet caught up. So why do they still believe? After everything, after the centuries of expansion, after the Serpent's Crusade, and the Narion War, and the long, slow work of building civilization in a dozen star systems, after the Unity has demonstrated empirically that the cosmos contains things that exceed any doctrine built for it, why do the churches still fill? Why does the Enlightened house still open its doors? Why do people in the farthest reaches of settled space still carve the shape of a serpent into the walls of their dwellings and mean it? Part of the answer is structural. Institutions persist. The architecture of belief, the rituals, the community, the ethical frameworks, the shared vocabulary for talking about the parts of experience that resist ordinary language. All of this creates dependencies that outlast the metaphysical claims that originally justified it. People do not generally leave faith the way they leave an argument they have lost. They leave it the way they leave a country, slowly, with grief, looking back. There is also the simpler matter of what each tradition actually provides at the level of ordinary daily life, which is, in many ways, the level that matters most. The Sanctum offers a frame for the experience of being alive in a beautiful and terrifying universe, a way of feeling the wonder of the stars and not having it tip over into existential terror. For a miner on a lonely outpost in the settled systems, who spends his days in rock and artificial light and looks up at a sky full of stars that represent, to the larger civilization, opportunity and progress, but represent, to him, mostly the distance between himself and anything that resembles home. The idea that God is present in that distance, that the enormity of it is not indifference but presence, is not a small gift. It may be the difference between a life that feels endurable and one that does not. The Enlightened offer something different but equally concrete. Community built on reciprocity rather than hierarchy, and a moral framework that does not require metaphysical premises to function. For someone who grew up inside a tradition that eventually demanded more than they could give, the Enlightened offer a place to land, a way of continuing to care about people and ethics and the project of making the world better, without the theology that made those things feel conditional on belief. This is not a minor offering. In a civilization that spans star systems and is full of people who have been uprooted and resettled and who have lost the coherent communities they were born into, the ability to walk through a door and be received into a community of people who share your values is not abstract philosophy. It is survival infrastructure. But structure alone does not explain the continued creation of new believers, people born into the settled systems, with access to everything that the Sanctum and the Enlightened and Va'ruun have produced, and who choose still to believe. Something is still being offered that people are still reaching for. The most honest answer is probably the one that none of the three major traditions would be fully comfortable with, because it does not reflect well on any of them as sufficient responses to the thing they are responding to. What people in the settled systems are reaching for, across every tradition and every variation of belief and non-belief, is the same thing that human beings have always been reaching for: a way to hold the scale of existence without being crushed by it. Space does not diminish that need. Space intensifies it. When your civilization spans star systems, when the sky above every world you live on is full of other worlds, when you are small, not just in the context of your planet, but in the context of dozens of inhabited systems and hundreds of uninhabited ones, and an essentially uncountable number beyond those. The scale of your smallness is not abstract. It is the view from every window. It is the sky you fall asleep under. It is the background against which every human drama, every political argument, every relationship and achievement and loss plays out. That is what the Sanctum is actually offering when it says that God is somewhere in the universe, waiting to be found. Not a claim that can be verified, but a way of standing in relation to the infinite that does not require you to feel annihilated by it. The universe is not indifferent in this telling. It is present. What you are moving through when you travel between stars is the body of something that cares. Whether this is true is a question that cannot be answered, but the alternative, standing in the full knowledge of the universe's scale and accepting that it does not care, that nothing looks back from the depth of space, that all the beauty and terror of it is indifferent to your existence, that alternative is also a choice, and not everyone is equipped to make it without cost. The enlightened, to their credit, make that choice and insist on it. They stand in the indifferent cosmos and say, "Then we will supply the meaning ourselves." This is a form of courage. It is also, looked at from a certain angle, a form of defiance, the same defiance that runs through all of human history, the refusal to accept that things are as bleak as the evidence suggests. The enlightened are not comfortable in the void. They have simply decided that comfort is not something they are willing to receive from a source they cannot verify. Va'ruun has made the same decision by different means, which is perhaps why Va'ruunism produces the responses it produces. They, too, have looked at the indifferent cosmos and refused the comfort of a caring God. What they found instead in the theology of the great serpent was not comfort but purpose. The purpose of preparation, the purpose of devotion to the ending. It is a dark solution, and the civilization built around it bears the marks of that darkness. But it is, and this is important, a solution to a real problem. The problem of how to live with the knowledge that the universe does not care. What none of the three traditions has fully managed is an integration with what the Pilgrim found, with the specific disorienting, luminous strangeness of the unity, the discovery that the cosmos is stranger than any doctrine prepared for, that the walls between realities are crossable, that the self is more provisional than it feels from the inside. The organized traditions were built before the unity was understood, and in some sense, they have not been updated. They continue to offer frameworks for human experience that were designed for a universe that turned out to be more surprising than the frameworks assumed. The Pilgrim's fragments do not add up to a theology. They add up to a practice, a way of encountering the strangeness without converting it into something manageable, a discipline of remaining with the question. It is not an answer to why humanity still believes, but it is perhaps the most honest description of what belief at its deepest level actually is. Not certainty, not doctrine, not the comfort of a church or the solidarity of a community, though those things matter. Just this, the refusal to look away from the largest questions, the willingness to remain in the presence of something that exceeds you, the decision made again every morning to find that enormity interesting rather than simply terrifying. Step back far enough from the settled systems, and what you see is not the theology of any one tradition. What you see is a civilization-wide grappling with the same problem that has driven religious thought for as long as human beings have been capable of it. The problem of scale, of what it means to be conscious and finite in a cosmos that is unconscious and essentially infinite, of how to build a life that means something when the backdrop against which it plays out is large enough to render any human achievement invisible from far enough away. The Sanctum answers, the infinite is sacred, and your movement through it is prayer. The Enlightened answer, the infinite is what it is, and your task is to build meaning inside it, not wait for it to be handed down. Va'ruun answers, "The infinite will consume you, and the only power left is the power of consent, of walking toward the consuming force with your eyes open and calling it devotion." The pilgrim answers nothing and asks everything, and leaves the question open for whoever comes after. None of these answers is complete. None of them could be. The question they are all responding to is not the kind of question that gets answered. It is the kind of question that gets returned to over and over, from new angles and with new information, and that changes you in the returning without ever quite resolving. The Sanctum changes this year as new discoveries are made. The Enlightened's humanist project shifts as understanding of what it means to be human shifts. Va'ruun, sealed in its isolation, may be the most static of the traditions, which may itself be a kind of answer to the question of what happens when a theology stops engaging with new information and simply doubles down. And the unity keeps turning. People keep walking through it and emerging on the other side, carrying memories that the new universe does not share, navigating the gap between what they remember and what exists around them, learning over multiple lives what remains constant and what does not, what survives the transit and what is lost, what, in the final accounting, might be called a self. The central question at the start of all this was not why religion survived into the 24th century. That was the surface. Underneath it was something quieter and harder to name, what the stars actually did to human belief when humanity finally reached them. Whether the cosmos, encountered directly rather than imagined, confirmed what any tradition predicted or complicated it beyond recognition. What the settled systems suggest in their uneasy, pluralistic, sometimes violent, sometimes genuinely beautiful way is that the cosmos did both. It confirmed the need. It complicated every proposed fulfillment of it. It turned out to be vast in ways that felt, to some people, like evidence for the divine, and to others, like evidence against it, and to a few quiet, difficult people writing in the margins of settled space, like something that exceeded both categories, something that required a new vocabulary no one has yet found the words for. The stars remember everything. They are very old and very bright and very far away, and they do not care. Or perhaps they are the body of something that does. No doctrine has settled the question. No amount of exploration has closed it. That is not a failure. It is what the question is. Keep looking.